Well, the announcement there from Jacques Ninaba being flanked there also by the captain of the Springboks, Siya Kolisi, ahead of the Rugby World Cup final that will be taking place on Saturday. Two noted changes also to the starting lineup, and also 100 Pollard and Faf de Klerk to run on side, making him the most kept 9 and 10 combination in Springbok history. But also to speak quickly about this, let's quickly look into this story. New research delves into the historical narrative of African rugby in South Africa, striving to uncover and validate decolonial perspectives. This extensive exploration is encapsulated in the forthcoming book, Umboxho, a collaborative effort involving numerous researchers and academics. The book not only sheds light into the history, but also uncovers the emergence of the South African non-racial rugby board in stark contrast to the South African Rugby Union. To provide deeper insights into the remarkable work, we are joined by Dr Buntu Siwisa, who is a senior researcher in Southern Center for Equality Studies at Wits University, and also we have Dr Philani Nongogo, who is a senior lecturer in Kinesiology and a coaching science program at the Department of Sport, Rehabilitation and Dental Sciences at the Tshwane University of Technology. And they're both now joining me in the studio. Well, Faf de Klerk there, who has made it onto the run on side, as we said a bit earlier on. Joining us in studio this morning is Dr Buntu Siwisa as well as Dr Philani Nongogo. And we spoke a bit earlier on about the incredible research that they've done looking into the role of African rugby. And also, I guess, the point of the book is also it speaks to the question around erasure. But before we deal with the research that has been done, Dr Nongogo, just quickly your reaction to the squad that has been announced and the two changes that we spoke about, and the money, of course, not making it at all.
Yep. I think to a typical rugby fan, I said to, and for the sake of the country, one in a public space, to really have to say, I wish the team very well. And in fact, the game itself on Saturday is going to be a very special one. People who have watched rugby in 1995 will still remember that. But coming to the specific question, it's a shock to me that money is not even making the bench. It's not even just changed, but not making the bench. That I think is the first takeaway. The second one, if you look at it, taking from there, is the fact that it suggests to me that the game plan is going to change. Mm-hmm. And I was listening to the coach saying that, of course, they pick the team depending on whom they are playing against. And he explained that the kicking game is going to be important. But I just want to a typical rugby fan who enjoys and understands rugby, I'm expecting a very difficult game, very close, very tight, especially when it comes to defense. New Zealand is a mobile team. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not sure if we have a fly-half that kicks and actually tries to do play the traditional structured game of the South African Rugby national team, because what Mane was giving to this team was in really playing and involving the wings. He's kicking across to make sure that the team that they're playing against is forced to defend. Yeah. Now, not to only attack. We know how attacking New Zealand is. So I'm not sure how they're planning around this. But I think I like the fact that Nyagana Trevor is making the bench. Ox is not starting, because people were talking about him starting, but I think it gives Batlalin, the forwards, some impetus there.
Yeah. Dr. Siwisa, not specifically focusing on the squad that has been announced now, but looking at the research that you and your co-authors have done here in the book Umboxho, what do you make of the transformation that we've seen in the Springboks, the national team that represents the country when it comes to rugby?
Well, thanks. It's been quite a long journey and for transformation in rugby in South Africa. And it's quite a coincidence that this book is coming out during the World Cup, because it marks precisely 2 centuries since 1820 that black people have been involved meaningfully in rugby. Yeah? And so I think that we've made great strides from the time that black people built their own first rugby clubs in the late 1880s, up until now. And I think Springboks have made very significant and huge strides in the transformation of rugby. Of course, there were some hurdles from the time of the unity talks in the early 1990s, and it took some time for the transformation agenda to really kick in. But I think really from the turn of the 21st century, and particularly from the 2010s, I think Springboks has made very significant strides in terms of black people participating in Springboks, and also the meaningful player positions and leadership positions that they are beginning to assume.
And also looking, just quickly before we move on, the chapter 1 of the book speaking about the time has come for African people in general, black people in particular, to make a concerted effort to write their lives into the South African rugby and sports historiography for the benefit of the future generations. What is it that you're trying to achieve with this book? And does this book also speak at all to the question that I raised a bit earlier on around the erasure of black people in the sport?
Well, what this book tries to emphasize is that, hence really the call then for people to make this concerted effort is that the history of black rugby has always been a history of black communities, in the sense that black institutions, black churches, the communities have lent a sense of blackness or have indigenized rugby. And so it is also at that level that the baton should be taken up in writing about the history of black sports, because it comes from communal level. And also the erasure of black history in rugby was also done at communal level, at local levels, when scorecards, when cricket scorecards, when rugby scorecards were taken by, were confiscated by the police, who thought that sports and rugby clubs were associated with anti-apartheid movements or organizations. And so it's always at the communal level that the erasure and the rebuilding and the rewriting of black people's participation in rugby and other sports.
Dr. Nongogo, speak to us then about the black rugby clubs that we had back in the days, and also then the emergence of the South African non-racial rugby board, the role that it would play, and why it was in direct opposition to the South African Rugby Union, SARU.
Thank you, Elton, for the question. The research out there, actually, picking up from what Dr. Siwisa was saying, tells us that probably the first rugby clubs, or in fact the first organized form of rugby was played in the schools. He talks about the churches. I mean, the rugby and cricket and many of these, association football, many of these are sports of the colonial project. They were part of the colonial project. I mean, when the British came, they came with the script because they've seen what has happened when Bartholomew Dias arrived and later the Dutch, led by Jan van Riebeeck. So when they got to the Cape, they really struggled against the Khoi and later the Xhosa on the other side. They realized, they thought it was going to be easy to just mold them over through the barrel of the gun. It didn't happen. It took 100 years. For the Frontier Wars. But then they realized that they needed to have another strategy. Part of that strategy was to, brought back the missionary work. And missionaries, after they've built all these forts, I mean, in the Cape, particularly in the Eastern Cape part, there are about 49 forts that were built to make sure that they really take over that part of the land. But of course, they realized that it was struggling. I mean, if I'm talking about 100 years, it's a problem. So what they did was to bring the missionary work. Church and schools and schooling, and that's where rugby and cricket and these sports came. And these young people were playing the sport, they were taken to school, they were taken to church. But something that was happening. There were auxiliary workers around these forts. Particularly, I don't know whether people really look deeply in the Xhosa history. There is a grouping that arrived in the Cape, particularly in the west-eastern side, called Amamvengu. And that group of people really, they felt alienated by the Xhosa nation, and they aligned themselves with the British, and that's where early rugby clubs came through. Winterose in Makanda, now in Grahamstown, it has got a direct relationship between the church, the schooling, and you see similar developments. We know the oldest known rugby black club is in Kimberley, the Universals, in 1986. 1886 later, in 1887, the African club is formed in Port Elizabeth. The Union Rugby Club, and usually they call it the Whites. And there's this glorification then of rugby clubs, and you see similar figures, people who are really in a very purposeful way, moving from one town to another. Forming, getting people to organize them to form these teams. So Grahamstown, Makanda now, Port Elizabeth, Gqeberha, and you move, there's a movement. One old man, Tshwane, traveled from Grahamstown to PE, moved from PE back to East London, the oldest team in East London, known as the Swallows Rugby Football Club. And they call themselves the Blues. And they had this hope associating with the color blue and the blues. And that team itself, they realized that to travel from one town to Grahamstown to PE to play, they needed to find a way, very creative way. They broke the team into two and formed an early rose so that they have a competition. So all these teams were purposely formed by people who otherwise ordinarily, if the politics and the social life was normal, they would have been in the leadership or in the communities, as Dr. Siwisa is saying, or in other part of the economic life.
Does the book speak to that question around, so both of you have now spoken about how schools and churches, for instance, had rugby clubs. Does it look into how a Craven Week, for instance, was much more elevated compared to what was happening at the time, and also that it only came in 12 years later?
That's exactly what we wanted to do, actually. And in fact, perhaps the great question could have been, why this book? In essence, given all these developments leading to the somewhat representative Springbok team, there's still narratives that still question why Kolisi is there, why Mapimpi is there. And sometimes when they do bad or for whatever things that happened, they say, yeah, it's a quota player anyway. So we're trying to join the dots. Kolisi's family and lineage in Grahamstown, who actually himself he doesn't understand, he doesn't know those people. If you read his book Rise and the documentary he did, same as Thando Manana, the old Bush Manana, China Manana, those are his lineage. One can trace all that. But unfortunately, these young chaps want to tell them, actually, you are not there just because whatever has happened, you got to grey. You have this long history of rugby, and we're not just telling them, we're telling young people to look up and see and understand that they're actually in this game, not by just chance. It's part of the traditions and history of the African people and black people in general.
Dr. Siwisa, as we conclude the conversation as well, don't you run the risk of people in the sporting field and people who have done research around rugby as well, seeing the book as trying to position and locate Africans in what is essentially a European sport and trying to position it as an African sport?
Well, it's actually what we're trying to say is that actually Africans have played rugby quite prior white South Africans, because it picked up with the white South African population at the turn of the 20th century, from 1899, while with, as I've pointed out and Nongogo has pointed out, with black South Africans, it really picked up from the 1820s, and they started their clubs in the 1880s. So really the point we're trying to make, rather than saying whose claim is more authentic or whose stake is more authentic on the sport, but we're rather trying to say that South Africans, black South Africans, have contributed significantly and meaningfully to the creation of South African rugby, to the culture and the history of South African rugby. And so rather let us look at all of these tapestries of the different cultures of rugby and weave together a more representative historical account of South African rugby, because what we've seen thus far are narratives of rugby which are either white or so-called colored history, and scattered tidbits on African involvement in rugby. And so we are trying to weave this together and saying that, look, let us first build up a body of African participation in rugby, and then we'll be able to have a more representative account.
So you're not claiming that it's an African sport?
Well, it is an African sport, as much as it is really a sport for all South Africans.
Do you quickly want to touch on that?
Yes, I think what we're trying to say is the history of rugby in this country is not complete without the African person. Mm-hmm. So African people have just mentioned that. They Africanize it. But I think your question is very important. How do we elevate the European sport? We don't deny that. Cricket and rugby are colonial sport. But what African people did was to take it to another level. What you said earlier, many people in South Africa don't know that it is African people who actually introduced the concept of young people participating in organized schooling competitions, 12 years before Craven Week. So the rugby history in this country doesn't say that. You find it in this book. And the details actually are how that development came about.
Okay.
So we gave saying white people in this country blueprint of how to really get the rugby to the communities. Okay. Because we're talking about rugby as played by people in a social space.
Who should buy the book? Who are you targeting with this book?
We're targeting South Africans. And we have been targeting international community as well. Because in Europe now, in France now, I don't know how many interviews I've been fielding from France and Germany, where people say black people in South Africa don't have a traceable history of rugby. And therefore it's Mandela who kicked them screaming, dragged them kicking and screaming to watch rugby or to be part of the rugby in 1995, which is hugely nonsensical.
It's almost like it didn't exist before then.
Yes, actually these narratives, one of the reasons it is.
But you could hear one of the questions, for instance, that was asked during that press briefing as well was about 1995.
Yeah, that's a point of reference which is problematic. We have 200 years of African people playing rugby, and in fact, one of the things we need to be saying. I don't know whether people were listening to Nick Mallet, who played rugby under the apartheid Springboks for that matter, and saying that SA Kolisi brought black people into rugby. I mean, in the Cape, there's literature on this. People in the Cape, I mean, the Northern Cape now, the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape. So as the part of the Orange Free State and Transvaal, we have chapters in this book that covers African people's involvement in rugby. They've played this game just as the same amount of time white people played. Actually, in some instances, African people played this rugby game before them. So,
okay. Thank you so much for your time. I don't know, I'm told by the team that there's a statement from World Rugby. I am struggling to get that statement. I don't know if we're able to quickly put up that statement on the screen, if it's possible at all, or if anyone of the team can tell me what exactly it is that the World Rugby team, the World Rugby said about Bongi Mbonambi. Okay, we understand that the World Rugby has decided that it will not be taking action against Mbonambi. Okay, let's just quickly get your reaction to that.
I think it was silly anyway. that there was such a thing. It's one of these mind games, and I think this colonial project of the game is still persistent. In rugby, you don't, as a player, go to the referee like a little boy to report a wrongdoing in class teacher. You go to captain. That's why the captain said, "I don't know anything. I didn't hear anything." So it was just a silly thing. And ridiculous. Yeah.
No, I certainly agree. But also, just quickly on the last point of the readers, we hope that this book will also be some kind of a reference book.
Yeah.
A reference book for everyone interested in the history of black rugby. Because we're building on also in the sense that we're hoping to have a sequel.
Okay. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but the book will be available from?
The 10th of November.
From the 10th of November. Thank you so much for your time. That is Dr. Buntu Siwisa as well as Dr. Philani Nongogo, who are some of the co-authors of the book Umboxho, which will now be released, and you can get your copy as well from the 10th of November. Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time.